The great Jewish theologian and philosopher of the 20th century, Martin Buber, said that there are two basic positions to life. A position that says yes to life, and a position that says no to life. For Buber, saying yes to life is a bit of a paradox, because saying yes to life doesn't primarily depend upon us seeking or striving or grasping for some abstract meaning to life. Once we start seeking, striving, and grasping, we begin to place ourselves at the center of the universe. And once we are there, we will seek, but we will not find. We will only continue to seek. You see, for Buber, saying yes to life doesn't primarily depend upon us. Saying yes to life primarily depends upon God's grace. Let me explain it like this. The Bible begins with a story so familiar to us that it tends to lose its radical power. But it's the fascinating story about the creation of the universe. After each day of creation, God apparently is very satisfied with God's work and says, "It is good." On the sixth day, God created human beings. In fact, as the story claims, God created human beings in the image of God. God created them male and female. God created them in the image, in his image. And then, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, in case anybody had any doubts about the goodness already in the universe, God looked over creation and said, "Indeed, it is very good." What does this story mean? People have debated it for centuries, but I will tell you now what it means. It means this. Look around. It means that God has created you and the people sitting next to you in God's very image. You want to see the image of God here on earth? Look at yourself. Look at your fellow human beings. It means that you are in the image of God, and it means that you are very good. God created you that way. God created your neighbors that way, and nobody can take it away. It means this. Jeannie, good. Bob, good. Brittany, good. David, good. Beth, good. Kurt, good. I'm not going to go through the whole, what is that thing called that we have that gives us names? Yeah, that thing. I'm not going to go through it. Shannon, good. Stephen, good. Janet, good. John, good. Liz, good. Brian, there's some dirty laundry there. He's a bit behind on his homework, and he just got in a fight with his brother, Christian. Actually, I just made that up. I don't know if that is true or not, but it allows us to follow the point that Genesis is trying to make. For God, your goodness doesn't depend upon you. It doesn't depend upon your morality. It doesn't depend upon how good or bad you have behaved. If faith were about morals, then you'd have to try really, really hard to be good in order to be accepted, in order to be loved, in order to be in the image of God. But the Bible begins by stating that humans already are good, already are accepted, already are loved, already are created in the image of God, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do to take that away. Now, the authors of Genesis were not naive. They knew the horrors of war and violence and economic oppression. In fact, this story was finally written down just after the ancient Jews had been conquered by another nation and were sent into exiles. The writers of this story were victims. They knew that bad things happened all the time to people, and that the world can be an extremely difficult place to be. And we know this too. We moderns have progressed in a lot of ways. but we still suffer from the same problems as our ancestors. We still live in a world of war and violence and economic oppression. Yet in the midst of all this violence, the authors of Genesis said yes to the world. They proclaimed and invite us to proclaim with them that the world and everything in it was created by a good God who made everything good. But we are left asking, why do bad things happen in a good world? I don't know. But you might say that Genesis 1 is a protest against war and violence and economic oppression. It says that that's not how the world is supposed to be. Because, as its fundamental core, the world is good, peaceful, and nonviolent. That might not be a satisfying answer, and it's easy to become cynical. Bad things that seem beyond our control happen to us all the time. Family members or friends may suddenly turn against us. We may lose a job. A dear friend may be struck with cancer. A loved one dies. In the face of suffering, we can easily become cynical about life. We can easily start saying no. Now, when confronted with pointed observations about cynicism and suffering, there is one question you should always ask. Has Stephen Colbert already answered this? In a commencement address at Knox College, Stephen Colbert told graduates that cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but it is the farthest thing from it. Because cynics don't learn anything. Because cynicism is a self-imposed blindness, a rejection of the world, because we are afraid of it. We are afraid it will hurt us and disappoint us. Cynics always say no, but saying yes begins things. Saying yes is how things grow. Saying yes leads to knowledge. So for as long as you have the strength to say yes. I'd like to tell you about two young girls who, against all odds, said yes. Our Old Testament reading that Brian read for us today tells the story of a young girl who lived in Israel roughly 2,800 years ago. Israel and her neighbors were frequently squabbling with one another. One of those nations was called Aram. The commander of the Aramean army was a brilliant military strategist named Naaman. The Arameans regularly raided Israel, and on one such raid, they captured this young girl in our story and forced her to be the servant of Naaman's wife. The story doesn't tell us much about the girl. We aren't even told her name. But I want you to take a minute and put yourself in this young girl's shoes. You're probably about 12 years old. Strange and violent people have come to your small village with weapons and threaten to kill you and your family unless your parents give them all their gold and silver. As they leave, they decide that that is not enough, and they take you captive. It's hard to imagine the pain and horror this girl was feeling as she was ripped from her family. She was a victim. Life had turned against her. She was taken away from everything that she knew. We could easily understand if she became bitter towards life, and especially toward her Aramean captives. If there was anyone who had an excuse to become cynical and say no to life, it was this girl. But remarkably, she didn't say no. She said yes. She was a victim, but she refused to have a victim mentality that seeks revenge. When she discovered that Naaman had leprosy, she suggested that he go to the prophet Elisha back in Israel, who could cure him. Now, if you want to know where Jesus discovered the importance of love, specifically the importance of loving our enemies, look to this young girl. How was she able to say yes to healing her captor? The story doesn't explicitly tell us, but I want to propose that despite all evidence to the contrary in her life, she knew God was good, to be good and worthy of being loved. Because she received the grace and love of God, she was able to be gracious and loving towards others. Because she knew God was for her, she could be for everyone. Because God said yes to her, she could say yes to others, including her enemies. Naaman took the young girl's advice and traveled to Israel to the prophet Elisha's house. Naaman knocked on the door. He expected Elisha would come out and see him, offer some prayers to Elisha's God, wave his hands around the spots, and poof, cure the leprosy. After all, Naaman was well respected, maybe well feared is a better way to put it, in his native country and in Israel. But Elisha doesn't even consent to walk to his door to see Naaman. He sent a messenger to Naaman who told him to simply wash in the Jordan River 7 times. This was offensive to Naaman. His personal and national pride was offended. He refused to go to the river and left feeling bitter. He said no to Elisha. He said no to Elisha's God. Unlike the young girl in the story, Naaman thought he was the victim, and he became cynical about life. He complained that Elisha didn't even come out to see him, and that the rivers in his native country were better than the Jordan River. So why couldn't he just have been healed there? And this is where things get really interesting in the story. We might expect the God of the Old Testament to react to Naaman in a specific way. We might expect the God of the Old Testament to mimic Naaman's no, to respond with God's own no to Naaman. You might have seen the Gary Larson cartoon called God at His Computer. God is watching the computer monitor, and there's a man walking down the sidewalk by an apartment complex. At the moment, he is underneath the piano that is being lifted by a rope. God is about to push the smite button. This is what we usually think of the God of the Old Testament, the great smiter. God is angry at just about everyone and smites people whenever possible. But there are other stories in the Old Testament that counter that conception of God, and this is one of them. One of Naaman's servants convinces Naaman to give the Jordan River a try. After following Elisha's directions and bathing in Jordan 7 times, Naaman was healed. He returned to Elisha's house and said to him, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." Naaman was converted because he knew that God was for him, not against him. And here's what I want you to get. The good God of love meets us where we are at. If you are like the young girl in the story, if you have faith in all the world, if you constantly say yes to God, and if you are morally good, God meets you there. God is for you. And if, like Naaman, if you have little to no faith, if you often say no to God, and if you are morally suspect, God meets you there. God is for you. And if you are like the rest of us and find yourself somewhere in the middle of these two characters, God meets you there. God is for you. God says yes to you. And the second girl that I want to briefly discuss is Malala Yousafzai. You have probably heard her story in the news this week. She is the Pakistani girl who at the age of 14 stood up to the Taliban. She fought for education for women. The Taliban had banned education for girls and persecuted her for her activism by shooting her in the face. Fortunately, Malala survived. Now here's a young girl who is a victim. She has every reason in the world to become cynical about life and say no. And yet Malala says yes. Since recovering from the Taliban's attempt to kill her and silence her voice, she has continued her activism by speaking around the world. This last week, Malala was on my other favorite television show, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. She told him that when she discovered the Taliban was seeking to kill her, she thought about how she would respond to her potential persecutors. At first, she thought she would try to violently defend herself, but then she thought better of it. As she told John Stewart, she began to think, if you hit a talib, then there would be no difference between you and the talib. You must not treat another with that much cruelty and that harshly. You must fight others, but through peace, and through dialogue, and through education. Then I'll tell him how important education is, and that I even want education for your children as well. And I'll tell him, that's what I want to tell you. Now do what you want. That response captured John Stewart's heart, and it continues to capture mine too. But what's important to understand, I think, is that along with the young Israelite girl in our Old Testament story, Malala's nonviolent response was formed by her faith tradition, not in spite of it. Malala is a Muslim, and while fighting for women's education is also teaching something to us about Islam, she is also teaching us about nonviolence in Islam. Like the Bible, you can find many violent verses in Islam's holy book, the Quran, but just like the Bible, you can find mercy and compassion. In fact, according to the Quran, God's mercy and compassion encompasses all things, including God's enemies. In addition, 113 of 114 chapters in the Quran start with, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. It is because Malala first said yes to God's compassion and mercy in her life that she was able to respond to her persecutors with compassion and mercy. It's because she first heard God's yes to her life that she was able to say yes to everyone else, including her persecutors. We learn something important about the character of God from these two young girls. We typically think that we get what we deserve in life, but these stories tell us that when it comes to God, we don't get what we deserve. We get grace. Jesus confirms this by healing the 10 lepers in our gospel reading today. Lepers were blamed for being sinners, and so it was thought they deserved their disease. But Jesus wasn't interested in blaming people. He was interested in healing people. He was interested in saying yes to everyone, but especially to those who only heard no from their culture. Along with the young Israelite girl and the Muslim Malala, Jesus reveals that God's grace, mercy, and love says yes to everyone. Now, it may be that in order to receive God's yes to our lives, we may have to say no to some things. No to a victim mentality that seeks revenge. No to a resentment. No to cynicism. But be careful of no. No can become addictive. I think that's why Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is where we hear God's yes to our lives. So may you receive God's yes into your life. May you find yourself embraced by the love and mercy of God that encompasses all things. And may you freely share God's yes, God's love, and God's mercy with everyone